welcome to the Debunking Economics podcast with Professor Steve Keen. I'm Phil Dobbie. Today, the speed of growth in an economy and the rate of inflation is driven by how much money is in circulation and how quickly it's changing hands. That's the theory. Yet the velocity of money seems to be forgotten about by mainstream economists, perhaps because it is rather inconveniently slowing down. So why is that? And what are the repercussions and what can be done about it? That's today on the Debunking Economics podcast. Well, if your money supply is constant, but the velocity of money changing hands slows down, that must mean a shrinking economy, right? But we've seen money supply increasing, of course, because we've had stimulus measures to try and correct the downturn in the economy. So maybe that's why the velocity is slowing down, just because there's so much more money. Except I'm looking at a graph right now showing that the US velocity of liquid money supply has fallen from a peak of 3.5 times in 1980 down to about 1.25 now. So that's not a reaction to an economic downturn or any sort of short-term stimulus. This is a long-term trend. So, Steve, if the velocity is slowing, but the money supply is more or less staying the same over time, it stands to reason economic activity will slow because we're spending less.
Yeah, and this is something that's been happening in America. Regardless of which time series you look at, it's been happening for some time period. The most profound measure of the velocity of money is using what's called money of zero maturity, MZM, which is a fabricated time series bringing together a whole lot of different elements, of including your basic M1, your savings, your check accounts and so on. M2, which includes deposit accounts, money market funds and so on. And that measure of velocity, quite intriguing. I've only just seen this data, but I'm looking at the raw data for the the velocity rate of turnover of money of zero maturity. And that, as I've known, rose from a rate of about 2 times per year back in 1959 up to a peak of 3.5 times per year in 1981. And ever since then, particularly in relation to economic downturns, it's trended down. And it is now running at a rate of about 1.3 times per year, nice. Which means almost almost 2/3 slower than it used to be back in the 1980s, meaning the same stock of money is generating virtually, say, 40% of the GDP that was generated out of a similar stock of money back in 1981-82.
So, I mean, that's a concern, isn't it? But, I mean, it does raise the question, which came first, the chicken or the egg? I mean, is money moving slow because economic activity has slowed, therefore we're less keen to spend what we've got? And I guess also if inflation isn't particularly high, then we haven't got that impetus to try and get rid of the money because we're not seeing it devaluing quite so quickly.
That is a major factor, and I think when you look at the highest velocity of money, it was actually when the rate of inflation was the highest as well. So if you take a look at the chart, it's actually very easy to find. We'll probably whack it in the podcast link, but it's a marvellous time series stored by the marvellous Fred, which is Federal Reserve Economic Data, Fred database maintained by the St. Louis Fred, and that particular graph literally peaks in 1981, and that was pretty much the maximum rate of inflation as well. So a high rate of inflation encouraged a high rate of turnover of money, and then since we were trending down in the rate of inflation, the rate of turnover has slowed down as well. But on top of that, I think a major factor has been, again, I feel like I'm a crack record whenever I've got to talk about it, but it's the level of private debt and the servicing of that debt, which as debt level has risen, I think means people are hanging on to money with the intention of paying their debt down by what they save. But as I've emphasised many times in this blog and on the Patreon website as well, saving money at the individual level becomes slowing down the velocity of money at the collective level. You can't save money into existence. You can accumulate more of the money that exists by spending your money more slowly, but because your expenditure becomes somebody else's income, your decision to save is a decision to reduce aggregate income by precisely as much as you drop your own personal expenditure. And given the level people are trying to save, it means the economy is turning over more slowly, which of course means it's harder to service the debt. So it's one of these catch-22s.
But I mean, you're going to use it as an opportunity to. Well, you're not going to use it as an opportunity to save, of course, if you're not getting very good interest rates on the money you are saving. So it's it's a double-edged sword, isn't it? I mean, on the one side, you were saying, well, okay, inflation is low, therefore I can hang on to my money, therefore I may as well save it and not spend it in the economy. But on the other side, presumably the central banks are going to respond to this somehow, aren't they? And say, well, okay, we can't raise interest rates if we've got a low turnover of the money supply.
Well, I don't think they're aware of it, because this is one of the dangers about being half right, which is Milton Friedman's situation. About the
that's my life story.
Don't worry, I wouldn't accuse of the same damage to the world that Milton Friedman has achieved. But by being half right about the importance of money and velocity of money, but wrong about how money is created, and wrong about the relationship between the stock of money and economic activity, it gave monetarism, in terms of looking at the money supply, a bad name. It meant people were looking at the wrong ways of defining the amount of money as well. So they're looking at all these various accounts in which people put money and wondering, do we include this or do we not include that in money? When you have an endogenous money perspective and you see private debt, the change in private debt creating precisely the same amount of money, because when you go into debt with a bank, it's because the bank has put precisely that much money into your bank account. Otherwise, you wouldn't accept the debt in the first place. Literally 100% equivalence. The change in debt is the measure of the change in money supply, and what we've had with a slowdown in the level of turnover of money, I think we've relied upon a higher creation of new money, which is a higher change in debt, of course, which is compensated until such time as the financial crisis hit, when people found they couldn't service their debt, banks didn't want to lend anymore in the fear of not getting it back, and you suddenly get a slowdown in the rate of creation of new money as well. So you get a double whammy, as well as velocity having quite seriously plunged, almost by a factor of 3. And then you've had an increased reliance upon private debt, going from of the order of, in America's case, of the order of 5 to 7% of GDP back in the 1980s to 15% by 2007. That compensating mechanism fails when you reach a debt ceiling, which America hit back in 2007, 2008. And now you've got low turnover of money combined with low credit, which is a recipe for a very depressed economy.
So there is a lot more to this discussion, including picking up on that point that Steve made just there, that maybe Milton Friedman's formula needs to be modified to include the change in debt to the formula, because people spend less when they owe more. And maybe that explains how, irrespective of the growth in the economy or otherwise, or the extent of the money supply, which has been up and down, the velocity of money has continued to slow. To hear the full discussion, become a subscriber of the Debunking Economics podcast at debunkingeconomics.com, or a supporter of Steve Keen on Patreon. If you pledge $10 or more support per month, you'll get access to this and all the other podcasts in this series. Simply go to patreon.com/Prof. Steve Keen to give your support to this series, and we'll see you back here very soon. Thanks for listening.